Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Jennifer Duke. When the federal government legislated Australia's emissions reduction target of 43% by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050, businesses were given something they really needed: certainty. They now know the target and everyone is working towards the same goal. But it's one thing to set a target, it's entirely another to actually achieve it. Today, we're going to take a closer look at some of the challenges businesses face in the net zero transition. Energy One is an energy services company working with Australian businesses to transition to net zero. Its parent company, NRG Services, has been responsible for major sustainability projects in Queensland, including the largest battery energy storage system of its type in Australia. Carl Duncan is the CEO of Energy One. Carl, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Hey, Jennifer, thanks for having me on.
So I want to get right into the big question firstly. Do you think that we can hit the target of 43% emissions reduction by 2030?
Yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? And it is a big goal. But I think goal being the important thing, right? And to have a plan and flesh things out. And like you discussed at the start, having certainty is such an important thing for business leaders all to get rallied around. And so, look, I think it's not going to be child's play. It's going to be a challenge for sure, and it's going to be more difficult for some than others. But I think what we see now is just really exciting. Everyone's kind of just, after years of, talking about things and reporting and kind of gearing up, we're now just seeing this really big heave-ho. Business leaders are wrapping their arms around it. Lots of the businesses we're talking to are getting after it and just getting things done. So, it's exciting times.
I absolutely love the optimism. I am keen to know if there are particular types of businesses or sectors that you think might struggle more through this transition than others.
Yeah, that's a big question. Actually, if I can just flip that, I think I'd probably talk to some of the examples of businesses and sectors that probably are less challenged because of the approach that they're taking. If I point to examples like the red meat sector, for example, they've set out an ambitious goal to be carbon neutral by 2030. And by doing that, whilst that is a big, BHAG of a goal, big, hairy, audacious goal, it's driven a whole bunch of research and development, a whole bunch of planning. It's driven investment and focus and expertise to come into the sector. And so by having that North Star, everyone gets rallied around it and starts to take a really good review of their own businesses and how they can align with those goals, start planning, and then more importantly, start doing the things that make sense today. So I think that's a good example of where having that foresight, that direction, that North Star is super important. But to come back to your question around what sectors I think might be challenged, obviously sectors where heavily into, say, fossil fuels, for example, where there may not be technologies today that can get them to net zero, then sure, that's obviously a lot more challenging, or where the investment is just such that it doesn't make economic sense, or there's not something viable today they can get into, then that creates longer, more difficult challenges, which, lots of people around the world are working really, really hard to solve.
Definitely. And I love that reframing at the beginning of your answer there about how it's not just necessarily about a broad brushstroke about a sector, but it's about their approach to it. And clearly there isn't really some sort of one-size-fits-all solution for businesses. So how complex is it for a business to come up with that pathway?
Like anything, I think it's about setting a North Star, setting a goal, taking a step back, being strategic about it. So, I don't think any executive or CEO or management team ever set out to grow a company without any growth goals or any aspirations. They always set, where they're trying to get to and rally around it. And this is no different. It's about taking a step back, getting experts in where it makes sense, looking at your emissions stack, looking at what technologies are available to you, depending on, the type of business, and then setting a plan out around it, making sure that it's resourced, making sure you've got capital, or making sure that there's appropriate business models there that can be leveraged to get towards net zero.
So when you're working with businesses at the moment, what are some of those big stumbling blocks that you're kind of working through with businesses?
Yeah, first of all, we obviously start with an assessment process and try to get our customers closer to understanding what makes sense for them here and now, what they can do today, and get those results and see how that drives benefit for their businesses. But definitely stumbling blocks. I think a lot of people just don't know where to start, especially A lot of the noise and things like that go around, with net zero can sometimes make it seem overcomplicated. We generally find the most consistent thing throughout the economy is energy supply. And so typically starting with that, usually we'll walk into a facility and pretty quickly we'll be able to identify the opportunities that make sense here and now and what technologies make sense for that business.
Stay with me, Carl. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Carl Duncan, the CEO of Energy One. Is there still a cost premium attached to greener energy? And does that make it kind of harder to sell to businesses who are already under financial pressure?
Yeah, it's two-sided. And the first part of your question there rings home. So with those soaring prices also means that the investment time or the investment is stronger in things like energy efficiency and renewables. What we see, though, is very much a tailoring, or what we apply is very much a tailoring approach. We're a customer-centric energy services business at Energy One. And so we'll always start with things like behind the meter or renewables that make sense on our customer sites first, coupled and integrated with energy efficiency, because chances are that's going to give the best bang for buck day one, as opposed to those, much, much bigger things like purchasing green energy, for example, off the grid as part of a long-term agreement. It really is horses for courses, though. So it's about understanding that particular business and what makes sense. And often it's cheaper. So, there doesn't have to be a premium attached to it. We're definitely seeing, lots of things like people fuel switch or electrify processes, and chances are that's actually cheaper than how they're doing it today.
That actually really surprises me. Does that surprise a lot of businesses as well when they're talking to you about what they can do?
Yeah, it does sometimes. But again, I think it's just like anything, right? When you get the right experts in that understand their field and understand it well, and you form a collaborative partnership with them and use that expertise well, then often that'll, you turn over a few rocks and you start to uncover a few opportunities there that can really enhance your business.
And we sort of discussed a little bit at the start about the importance of certainty for business. How important has that been for knowing the path ahead, having those goals and those stepping stones in place?
I think it really rings home. You can't put a value on having certainty, particularly, Australian business leaders have got a really good radar of what works and what's coming at them. And when that position is set and, it's kind of everywhere, everybody starts to get rallied around it, talks about it, I think everybody knows that now it just makes sense. And so they're really just getting into it. And so that, that business certainty as a community, as a business community, is a really, really powerful thing.
Definitely. I think there's a big tick in the certainty box, which is wonderful. Speaking still of government, is there enough support, though, in other ways from government for businesses to transition at the moment? Are there other things that you'd like to see?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think there's a whole gamut of grants and various types of funding support or loans, equity, or, all sorts of mechanisms to help organisations transition to net zero. And that's a great thing. Certainly having certainty around where the country is trying to get to is a good thing also. Probably the gap for us, there's a whole bunch of effort on transitioning utility scale energy supply, which is great. It's fantastic. It'll get us some big results. But we probably think there's still a bit of a gap around what we call DER, or distributed energy resources, and energy efficiency. Those are the things we see on customer sites or on business sites within their own boundaries that can really drive and enhance productivity for businesses specifically. And so, we think there's probably a bit more that could be done there to really turbocharge the whole net zero transition and provide some real value for businesses.
And the other thing I was going to ask you about is, I know you've mentioned that sometimes we're seeing executives now increasingly bringing in those experts to help with this transition. Are you finding that boardrooms and executives they have the right skills at the moment to understand what they need to do for the transition? Are they bringing in the experts at the right time? Have you got any reflections on that?
Yeah, getting around and sort of talking to a few executives within my network, I think they're starting to, and probably the conversation's really shifted more into or been woven into sustainability strategy, which I think is a really clever thing. So, a lot of executive C-suite people I'm talking to are thinking about not just how can I bring the benefits forward now, how can I reduce my energy costs and all those sorts of productivity gains and good things that the net zero transition can bring to their business. But they're also going a step further and baking in sustainability strategy and working with organizations like Energy One to say, okay, I've got this brand. How can I plug in a net zero strategy? How can I make my brand and my product more valuable? How can I get a seat at the table with my customers and bring my sustainability A game? And so, I think that's a really clever move, and we're seeing a lot of organizations and well-known brands wrap their arms around that and start to bake it into their businesses going forward.
It's absolutely fascinating, and I think this is a place that we'll be looking at very, very closely going forward. But Carl, thank you very much for talking to Fear and Greed.
Oh, thanks very much, Jen. I'm a long-time listener, so I really enjoy the podcast and enjoy doing everything you're doing, but thanks for having me on the show.
And that was Carl Duncan, the CEO of Energy One. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Jennifer Duke, economics correspondent for Capital Brief and filling in for Sean Elmer. Have a great day.